Tātou i ngā iwi, i ngā reo, i ngā hoe whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Paul Chalmers from the fabulous Fabian Society, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Shamobeel today. He was on the radio this morning. I hope you heard it. It's pretty damn interesting. It's one of those focus on what's happening in the future. So I'd like introducing Phil, one of our members, to introduce Shamobeel.
This one. I do this one?
That one's short, you see. It's
Well, I was a little person once. I have been smaller than I am now. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I was really taken by an article that Shamobeel wrote for the spin-off earlier in the year, where he talked about the demographic patterns that were impacting, well, the new population data that was affecting Auckland, and how that creates a insight into a new dynamic, a new political environment, a population shift and a drift which is causing, or should cause, people to think again about what is the nature of this extraordinary conurbation that we've got that's called Auckland. It's the largest collection of seats in the country. It's got an awfully large amount of power, but as I think we've seen in the last few weeks, the relationship between the power of Auckland and the power of Wellington and over, for example, housing and transport is not a known quantity. It's a shifting place, and it's a place where sometime we're thinking we're winning, and sometimes we're pretty obvious that we're losing. And under those circumstances, it was pretty, I thought, important to get Shamobeel to expand on the article, and we invited him along. I'm really pleased that he's come. He was one of the very earliest of all of the Fabian alumni that we had way back when Fabians began in Auckland. He was a very willing contributor. I'm incredibly impressed with the way in which he brings an independent point of view to not just the economy, but also to the wider political debate in New Zealand. And I think I can reference the fact that he did that amazing work for the Helen Clark Foundation on the concept of social cohesion, which no doubt would form part of the topic that we're going to discuss tonight. So without more ado, can I please welcome and thank Shamobeel for coming to Auckland. Cheers.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for having me back. On the Social Cohesion Survey, I'm actually writing the results for the latest survey at the moment. So that's going to be coming out on the 24th of April, if anybody's interested. Yeah, very happy to talk about the social cohesion stuff. And this year, we've done quite a deep dive into the impact of social media. We've done a real deep dive into understanding what kind of habits of social media has impact on how we feel, whether we feel connected. And speaking a little bit, giving you a little bit of a preview here, but it's not whether you use social media per se, it's whether you have a variety of media diet. It's really, really important you get yourself exposed to a range of sources of information. So that's the main thing that I found, because there's a lot of American and other survey data that shows that if you just use social media lots, it's really bad for you. But actually in New Zealand, what we found was lots of people were using it really well to connect with each other better. But you can't rely on social media as a substitute to having a wide variety of media and news information. Okay. Today's talk, Born Here Now, it was really out of this set of data. So, you know, I'm a nerd, I love looking at data, and I was looking at the number of babies that are born in New Zealand because, you know, we're having fewer babies. And then I realized that you can actually look at the babies born by reported ethnicity. And in Auckland, for the first time, we now have more Asian babies being born than any other ethnicity. And that felt to me like a reason for us to kind of have a look at this closely. The other reason is I wrote a report for MBIE and the Auckland Policy Office on the economic contribution of ethnic minorities. The New Zealand report was released last year, and the Auckland report is going to be released on Friday. And that's essentially a look at a lot of what I'm going to show you today. So, do you guys have a clicker? You can be my clicker. Before I start, I just need to tell you that I'm the chief economist at Simplicity. If you have lots of money to invest, please put it in our thing. We're very low cost. But I can't give you financial advice, so anything I say to you today is not individual financial advice, it's general commentary. So there's a few things I want to take you through today. The first is Auckland's diversity. It's a fact, right? We know it. We probably don't see as much of it in this room as we should. But I think there is a lot of diversity in Auckland that's absolutely palpable when you live in the community. The question for us is, will it be a strength? Because it's a potential for strength, but it's not yet being realized. It could just as easily be a source of conflict and a source of division. I think it would be a mistake if we let that happen. Already in the economic data, we see that the potential of ethnic communities is underutilized. So for example, across most immigrants, we find their qualifications are really high, but they're not working in the qualifications that they have. Their incomes, after controlling for everything else, is well below what they should be. So we bring these people in and then go, all right, you go do you. Why did you bring all these people in if you don't want to make the most of them? So there is an element of potential both for the immigrants and the people of ethnic minorities, but also for New Zealand. You can't have an economy that's built on exploitation and expect good outcomes. There's an element where our political and policy thinking is the system is neutral. We're above it. We don't influence anything. We'll set the rules and everything will happen. Because they never actually read Adam Smith and they never really understood what he talked about in his book. Everybody thinks, so I don't know if you guys know, Adam Smith's book, Wealth of Nations, is 250 years old. Most people haven't read it and most people don't know, and everybody thinks he talks only about the force of the market. Absolutely not true. In fact, he was a champion for the common man. And his purpose of a lot of the interventions was very much to make sure that the invisible hand of the market did not do bad things for communities. So there is a real issue here where our system, our politics, our policymakers, our institutions are very much designed towards going, we will just set the thing up and everything will just take care of itself. And with immigration, that's particularly so. You've got the skills, we've done the filter, you've come here, go make a good life. If you don't, it's your fault. But the fact that we haven't set the systems up and the process up to help people do that is not recognized. There's also an element of, I think, social and individual behavior. When a society changes, it can't be only up to the new person to change. The person who's also here has to change. And that two-way process is difficult. And it's challenging for both groups. And we need to make it easier for people to do in a non-competitive, positive way. Phil and I were talking about just before, how does it happen? Where are those third spaces that we meet each other, spend time with each other, and find each other's humanity? Because when you don't, you just see an immigrant, you just see a brown person, you just see a yellow person, you see a person who's different. What you don't see is the common elements, the more that we have in common. So that's the kind of a broad outline of what I want to talk to you about today. But I just want to show you the chart that caught my attention. So that's the one on the left. And on the orange line is the number of Asian babies. Now, Asian is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. What the hell is Asian, right? But it still is useful because we like to label things, right? And when you've got a label and a data point, all of a sudden you can have a conversation about something. And this is pretty much what I do as an economist. You put a big dollar figure on something, it's like, oh my God, isn't it terrible? And then people are like, okay, let's have a conversation. And then you can talk about the causes and the potential solutions and the trade-offs that are required. But this was essentially one of those moments, I think, to me it was kind of like, we've known that Auckland is changing. We could see that things were shifting, and yet we were not grappling with it. I needed a hammer to crack this nut. I needed somehow for political parties, politicians, policymakers to engage with this. And fundamentally, though, what we're thinking about when this change happens is this issue of acculturation, that need for us to protect our culture and heritage, and the relationships that we want with each other. Both of those things are true, right? We want to do both of those things, but you can't. You can't have it both. Once you interact with a whole bunch of different people, your culture changes. Culture is constantly being rewritten, right? It literally is reshaped every single time we interact. That is the point of culture. And yet, we've got this tendency to try and preserve it because that's a very human emotion. And that's the invitation. The invitation of this increase in diversity is to ask ourselves, what does it mean for us to have culture and heritage and how that shifts? And how does it interact with the relationships that we seek and the relationships that we deepen? And the reason why that matters is because, as you know, New Zealand is going to look a hell of a lot different in the future. And it's going to hell of a lot different because of two things. First, we haven't had enough babies in New Zealand for a hell of a long time, right? And you can see that on the left-hand side, that's New Zealand's birth rate. It was very high during the post-war era, and pretty much since the 1970s, New Zealand's fertility rate has been below replacement. So we haven't had enough babies for a long time. The babies we are having now are much more likely to be Maori, Pacifica, and Asian. That means our future is definitely going to be different from our past. Not only that, you can see on the right-hand side, not only did we not have a baby boom that continued, we followed up the baby boom with an immigration boom. And that immigration boom has been significant. I have some big concerns around our sustainability of addiction to immigration, because New Zealand politics goes something like this. There is a recession, we need more shamubils. People don't like the traffic, we don't want any more shamubils. We swing between one or the other, right? It's either not enough or too many. There is nothing in between. So when we use immigrants as economic pawns, I think that's a really big problem, because you lose the social license to sustain it. And in our last year's social cohesion survey, we found a stat that I found quite shocking. In New Zealand, about half of New Zealanders think that immigrants make good citizens. Half. In Australia, just over 90% of Australians, who I think are far more racist than us, think that immigrants make good citizens. Over 90%. I think we've lost that ability to absorb immigrants in New Zealand, and that's a concern. That's a concern both in terms of the immigration that we might need in the future, but also the people here, who look like me, who are immigrants despite how long we stay here. And my children, who are going to look like immigrants even though they were born here and they've grown up here. And I think there are some really big social pressures that might be building as a consequence of this. This is a very complicated kind of picture, but essentially there are two kind of boxes that I think about. One is about the attitudes of immigrants and the attitudes of society at large. And on the left-hand side are the kinds of choices that we have in terms of what we sustain of our own culture and heritage, and how much interaction we have with each other. So when you have lots of interaction, and you adopt a lot of the existing or the host country's culture, you have integration. For the host society, when you've got lots of interaction, you adapt to the new cultures that are coming in, you have multiculturalism. But those are not the only options. As you can see on the checkerboard, there are many other options. And there are some very negative options there as well. On the immigrant group, there is that whole kind of marginalization that can take place, or what we can see on the host society where we can see exclusion. And I think these are the trade-offs that we're thinking about, is the future that we're looking at is not binary. It's not one or two choices. It's many choices, many interactions that could take place. We have to be deliberate if we want to make use of the immigrants that we have in our society, if we want to make use of the diversity that's here. Because when cultures meet, there is an interaction that we have to take deliberately and we have to sustain. It can't just be left for it to happen. So I think this is the framework that kind of does a lot of the heavy work in this thinking. It's a bit complicated, it's a bit nerdy, but I think this is the framework that when I looked at it was like, I can see what we're really talking about here. We have some big choices to make as a city in particular, but also as a country, because what happens in Auckland will happen in the rest of New Zealand soon enough. I was telling Phil that I've been doing this documentary. I've been filming this documentary in Tokoroa and Balclutha. In Tokoroa, I was surprised to learn that it has a huge Cook Island population who came for the forestry processing. I didn't know that until I went and found out. They call it the 16th star. It's one of the biggest population concentrations of Cook Islanders. In Balclutha, the second most spoken language is Samoan, right? Not only Samoans who are coming from Samoa, but a lot of Samoans from Auckland have moved down there because there is work and people are making a good life. You know, if you're a laborer and you're working in Auckland, life is pretty tough. If you're a laborer and living in Balclutha, life is pretty sweet. So there are real choices that we see, and there were some big pressures that I saw when I was in Balclutha. Talking to one of the Samoan ladies, she said, you know, when I first came here, I applied for a job at a cafe, and they said, oh, but you're Samoan, shouldn't you be working at the freezing works? So, for real? And She said, yes, that's exactly what happened. And she said, but that has changed. She's been there for 10 years, and now, she's an accepted member of community and a celebrated member of community. I went to the high school graduation ceremony, and it was beautiful. They had kapa haka, they had Pacific celebration, and in each of these, what was funny was about half of the kids were Pākehā. And that was wonderful. That's what you want. That's what it looks like, right? That's what I was talking about in terms of multiculturalism and integration. It was a shared identity amongst the kids. And that's perfect, right? That's what we want in these communities. So I think it's important for us to, I think, keep in the back of our mind is there are many options, many ways this could unfold. And it's not a given. It's up to us and up to our policy choices to make sure we make the right choices or choose the right things. Can you do next? So ethnicity is a really tough one, right? So my kids are kind of half and half. So which ethnicity are they? One of my boys looks like me and one of the boys looks like my wife. So, ethnicity is a very complicated label. And so if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, it shows you that about 30%, yeah, I can't see my own things, but about 30% of kids under 15 identify with more than one ethnicity. So multiple ethnicities is becoming a thing. This label of you're Asian or you're Indian or you're Chinese is getting harder and harder. And yet that's how we collect the data. That's how we classify. That's how we stratify society. And you can see that when you look at the babies in Auckland, lots of Indian babies, lots of Chinese babies, lots of Filipino babies. But when you look across those numbers, roughly about 30% of them are going to be Chinese and Indian or something else or something else or something else. So the very nature of ethnicity in Auckland is shifting really rapidly. And you can see that that's not true for older generations in Auckland, right? Because we didn't have that diversity in New Zealand back then. I don't know why I'm clicking this. This doesn't do anything. The reason why Auckland's kind of had this big impact is because, not just because of immigration, it's also because we export so many people. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, what you can see in the gray bars is our natural population growth. That's babies, less deaths. The green bars are people who are in net, either moving to Auckland from the regions or moving out to the rest of New Zealand. And the orange bars are international migration. So essentially, since the since about early 2000s, we've exported people to the provinces, right? So Auckland's had this kind of long history of essentially going, Auckland's too expensive, too congested, you go somewhere else. And we tend to export a lot of people who are in their middle ages, family formation ages, and retirees from Auckland to other places. The main beneficiaries tend to be Waikato and Bay of Plenty. Although more recently, every time I go to Queenstown, I feel like all of Auckland's down there now. But you can also see just the movements. Auckland's a very dynamic place. There's a lot of flow that takes place. There's people coming in, there's people going out. So the picture on the right is a little bit complicated, but essentially what I'm trying to show you is all the kind of ins and all the kind of outs. So the green bars are all the people who are coming in, and the gray bars are all the people who are going out. So even though it doesn't look like population hasn't grown that much, underneath that is a huge amount of churn of people coming and going. So Auckland's this extraordinarily dynamic place. And as a result, what happens is that when something happens in Auckland, very often, it seeps out to the rest of New Zealand. They don't want it, but it just happens. And if it's good, it will seep out to the rest of New Zealand, but if it's not good, they'll take the baggage with them. Next slide, please. And so the cumulative effect, though, has been really big. And I'm throwing a lot of charts at you, but I just wanted to kind of get you to understand the scale of the change that's going on. And I think particularly that green line of the Asian population in Auckland, I mean, it's been extraordinary, right? And it's been a huge growth, particularly from China, India, and Philippines. And you can see just how strong that growth has been. And you can see that, that breakdown on the right-hand side, there is a huge amount of kind of variation within that. But the cumulative effect is that Auckland's changing really, really fast, not just because of people who are coming in, but because we're exporting a lot of the people who look like old New Zealand, right? So it's much more likely to be Pākehā that move out to the provinces than ethnic minorities. The next slide, please. But even within the diversity, there is diversity, right? There's people like me who've lived in New Zealand for God knows how long. I feel quite old now, right? But I've lived in New Zealand since I was 13. So I've lived here for a long time, and then there's other migrants who have only lived here for a few years. And our experiences and conception of New Zealand are entirely different because we've lived with New Zealand in different ways, and we've grown up differently. And that's kind of what I'm trying to show you here on the left-hand side. You can see that, you know, the number of people of different ethnicities, some of them are recent, some of them have been born here, and some of them have been here for a long time. So even within the diversity, there's a huge amount of diversity. And it's important to kind of look at that and understand that ethnicity or diversity does not instantly mean recent immigrant. And yet that's how we quite often treat people, because you look like a brown person, so you must have just come off the plane, right? Do you not deliver Uber Eats? People don't say that to me, not you, Shamabil, the other brown people. And you can see how quickly that has had an impact on Auckland, how in 2001, over half of our population was Pākehā, and now we are below 40%. This is a very rapid pace of change. And this is important in the sense that when you have change that is so fast, it is hard for the host community to adapt. You have to be deliberate and you have to be consistent in the way that you do this. If you don't, you're going to have lots of issues that can crop up. Next slide, please. But those issues are not equally spread across different generations. So in my kids' school, for example, you know, the minority ethnic community is Pākehā. And that's true of most schools now, where you see a huge amount of diversity. There is not really a majority ethnicity in schools. It's just become really diverse. And you can see that on the left-hand side of those young age groups, very diverse. And you move towards the older age groups, and of course we've got much more Pākehā, much whiter New Zealand, much more old New Zealand. And that's just the reality of our history. That's what it looks like. But what our kids are growing up with in terms of their experiences of interaction, their experience of diversity, their experiences of what Auckland looks like is so different from what I grew up with, what you grew up with. I don't know if I can even imagine what it's like. And so there is an element of we have to be really deliberate about talking to our across generations to understand those differences. They talk about diversity differently. You know, for a lot of young people, they don't even see the things that we see. You know, the labels that we see, they may not see. Next slide, please. And from an economic perspective, there are some issues. And the reason why I talk about the economic perspective is because this is quite often where the bias turns up. This is where the discrimination shows up. So again, quite busy, quite a lot of data in there, but essentially what I was trying to show you is that when you look at the qualifications of our ethnic minority communities, you can see they hold more qualifications than the population on average. They're a highly qualified population, and it's a product of our immigration system, right? Because we say we want people with lots of qualifications to come here and work as employees. Not entrepreneurs. We want people who are going to come here and do jobs because we want to fill labor shortages in New Zealand. That's our primary motivation, right? And that kind of shows up if you look at the right-hand side, if you look at the rate of entrepreneurship in New Zealand, you know, it's not that high for ethnic minorities. So unlike places like the US, in the UK, you see huge amounts of entrepreneurship amongst migrant communities because you've got people with the drive and all of that kind of stuff. But in New Zealand, we try and screen those people out. Don't want the entrepreneurs. We want the workers. So there is a deliberate policy choice here that we use to in our immigration system. So we should not be surprised by that. But it's not just that we screen for people to come into New Zealand. It's also that there is all the usual issues. When you start a business, it's not just starting a business. Having access to capital, market knowledge, those relationships, networks, those are really important, really powerful. And those things are hard to develop and hard to harness if you don't know them. In terms of work, very kind of consistent patterns. Latin Americans really kind of stand out as super hardworking people. So right across, both in Auckland and in the South Island, particularly in Queenstown, pretty much the hospitality industry is dominated by Latin Americans. People from Brazil, people from Argentina, they're working their butts off. You know, I met the cleaners when I was down in Queenstown for Christmas holidays. They're all from Brazil. And I said, why do you guys do this? Like, well, low barriers to entry, we look after our people, and this is a job that we can do easily. because a lot of them had qualifications. They had university degrees, but those qualifications were not recognized in New Zealand. They couldn't get a job. So I've got a very well-qualified cleaner, cleaning my toilet. It's just ridiculous. But they're working really hard. But at the same time, it's not just that they get jobs, it's also that people are looking for work and they find it hard. We find that particularly for the African people, there is a lot of barriers to the labor market in New Zealand. So generally for Asians, I think the barriers have diminished quite a bit because of that experience and exposure over time. But for Africans, there is still a huge amount of pressure. There's still a lot of racism and discrimination that they experience. Next slide, please. But the thing that really comes through is that high qualifications just as likely or more likely to be at work, but will earn less. And that's what you can see on the right-hand side. On average, ethnic minority communities earn less than the New Zealand average. The AUT for the MEC, the Ministry of Ethnic Communities, did a piece of work last year trying to understand what explains the difference in income. And essentially they could kind of go through a whole bunch of things, they could understand a whole bunch of it, but essentially roughly about 8% of the income gap could not be explained by any variable we understand. And for me, that interpretation is that's the discrimination. Because you're brown, because you're yellow, because you're black, you'll get paid 8% less than everybody else. That's the consequence. And there is a real impact there, right? There's a real impact in terms of that person, but also the way that we talk about productivity. What is productivity in an economy? It's the wages and profits of businesses. If you have low wages, why are you complaining about having a low wage economy? You're literally saying that I'm going to pay low wages but don't want a low wage economy. Be consistent. Next slide. So a lot of this kind of this thinking for me has been around understanding that here's this thing that's happening that we haven't been very deliberate about because we just wanted this to happen. We wanted an easy answer to have population growth, didn't want to think about other things. And Auckland in particular really matters because Auckland, I think, is unique, and I think Auckland creates some really good opportunities. The biowave is happening here, and it is the most connected place in New Zealand. Next slide, please. Busy picture. I've got lots of busy pictures, but essentially if you look at the movement of people, on the left-hand side is migration between regions in New Zealand from Auckland. And you can see that there's a huge amount of in and outflow that takes place across all ethnicities. There is people moving in and out of Auckland all the time. There's this great exchange that I described before. It's my Samoan friends in Balclutha, right? It's the fact that we've got retirees and families who are living in Hamilton. So that great exchange means that whatever happens in Auckland, they take that with them when they go to these places. We have a lot of people from outside of Auckland region who commute into Auckland, right? So every day we have about 35,000 people who commute into Auckland. So there's a huge amount of connection that Auckland has. Our boundary is very porous and malleable. Next slide, please. It's also a really big business connector, and I think people don't think about this connection very often. But essentially, when you look at businesses, any business might have another unit somewhere else, right? You might have a branch in Hamilton or whatever. And what we found was, when you look at the connections of businesses across New Zealand, there are huge amounts of connections to Auckland. And so with Auckland, we have very strong connections with Wellington, Canterbury, Waikato. You can see that on the left-hand side. And there's a whole bunch of regional enterprises that have their staff in Auckland as well. But what that picture on the right-hand side is trying to show you is the strength of connections between the big cities, big regions of New Zealand. And it's a very complicated, kind of unnecessarily complicated picture. But essentially, that big blob is Auckland. And pretty much every connection that happens between businesses in New Zealand goes through Auckland. Auckland is the gateway. Auckland is the connector. Auckland is the spider at the center of the web. And that's why I think it's so important for us to think about Auckland in a slightly different way. It's not like Wellington. Everybody thinks, people in Wellington think they're the center of Wellington, right? They are not. They make the rules and regulations and enforce it from there, but the reality is from business and people and other connections, it is Auckland that is at the center of the web. Next slide, please. It's also that Auckland is unique. It's actually a very different kind of place. Again, a busy picture, but essentially what I'm trying to show you there is if your bubble's up top, your human capital is very high. That means if you spend your working life here, you're probably going to earn a hell of a lot of money, probably up around $1.5 million. On the right-hand side is how complex our economy is. And Auckland is a really complex economy. And what I mean by that is we have a huge variety of things. Not only do we have huge variety, we have huge depth in the things that we do. No other place in New Zealand does that. It is literally no other place except for Wellington. And Wellington only happens because you have to be there, right? If you're a bank, you must have a head office there. If you're whatever, you need to have some presence because you've got to lobby the government to get your policy through. But the reality is that, I don't even have to talk to her anymore. Next slide, yeah, it's good. While that's true, while it's true that Auckland offers this extraordinary opportunity, it's not true that Auckland offers the same opportunities for everybody. So the average kind of human capital. So this is again a little bit nerdy, but essentially what I'm trying to show you here is that if you're in that orange dot, which means you're quite highly qualified, you earn a ton of money in Auckland, right? No other place compensates you so well for living in Auckland. But if you're a laborer and you don't have any qualifications, your life sucks everywhere. You earn little everywhere. But the cost of living in Auckland is really, really high. And as a result, what we find is many people who move out of Auckland, including to Australia, are not people with lots of qualifications. It's just common folk. Because why wouldn't you? Because you could go somewhere else, earn more, and have a lower cost of living. So Auckland has some issues in that we are starting to become hostile to many of our citizens. And there are some real pressures that are building up. And that's part and parcel of, is that pressure building up because of all those foreigners who've come in here? Is it because of the diversity? Is it because of something else? Even if it's not true, those are the questions, those are the kinds of thoughts that will enter into the public narrative. Next slide, please. It's also true that Auckland's not one place, right? And so this is, again, a complicated picture. I love this kind of stuff. But essentially, each of those colored areas is one kind of labor market area. That's where kind of people work and play within. But if you look at the right-hand side picture, you can see Auckland's kind of split into three areas. There is South Auckland, Central Auckland, and North Auckland, right? And these are actually quite distinct places. And they don't interact with each other. So when we talk about Auckland, I'm kind of mixing up three different communities. And each of these communities have quite different expressions. And you know this, right? You know this from going over to the North Shore where there is a real concentration of Korean population, right? Or the South Africans who congregate in a particular suburb or whatever. It's okay if a little bit of it happens. But what happens when you get this excessive concentration of people and it becomes an enclave? And it becomes a source of isolation and disconnection. And that becomes a source of risk. The kinds of riots and social incohesion that we saw breaking out in the UK, I think was in large part to do with their disconnection and concentration of people in ghettos, which I don't think is happening in New Zealand yet, but I'm really fearful that as we segregate, becomes a problem. So Auckland isn't one place, and there is a lot of, I think, complexity that's hidden underneath these big labels that I'm putting on today. Next slide, please. Now, I've been talking at you a lot, and part of the reason is a defense mechanism because I don't know what to do about it. The answers are not obvious. It's really hard. But I'm going to try and kind of give you a few thoughts because Phil told me that I must. The underlying theory behind that, though, is just the idea that if we want a better future, we have to be willing to bear some costs and to share some benefits. And that's a hard thing to hear for a lot of people because quite often the way we think about things is, I will do nothing to change myself and everything will be better, right? Think about our policy conversations. We should deal with climate change, but no taxes and no changes in anything. Well, making good progress on that, aren't we? So when we think about a better future, that's kind of what I'm trying to think about is we can't take a zero-sum thinking to it. We can't take a unicorn lens to it. We have to think about it as requiring investments. We have to think about it as giving up some things and changing ourselves. We have to be willing to do those things, and sometimes those investments will not bear fruit for us. Recently, I was looking at reading some stuff about Muldoon. And I always describe Muldoon as the drunk uncle. And very unfair because, the period that he lived through, he did a lot of good stuff. And he did some terrible stuff too. And what was really fascinating, though, was it was so clear that his politics was entirely about trying to preserve life as if it was 1960. And he failed. He tried and he tried. He threw everything at it and it failed. And that's why he's the villain. If he had succeeded, he would be a hero, right? And the reality is that I think when you read that, you realize that a lot of what happened back then was trying to preserve the past. One particular line really stood out to me. And he said, when he was canning our compulsory super, he said, "Why bother? The benefits won't be seen until 2028. Sitting here today, I'm going, well, that would have been quite nice, 2020 is not that far away. We'd be away laughing. We would have had $1 trillion in our compulsory super now. God, we could have done with $1 trillion now, couldn't we? So that better future doesn't arrive very soon for ourselves, but it happens very quickly for our children and grandchildren. So next slide, please. So there are some 4 kind of explicit actions that come from, I guess, the barriers that we see. The first is really around, we've already imported all these people with all these great qualifications. Can we just use them, please? It's not hard. It's really about making sure their credentials are recognized and understood. There is a real problem with recruitment. Most of the barriers are not ethnic people getting fired, right? Because you're brown or yellow or whatever, you don't get fired more than everybody else. In fact, there is no evidence that once you've got a job that you face that much discrimination. Of course, there is some, but in reality, once that you've hired somebody, you realize, oh, this person's all right. It's not just a brown person, that's my colleague or that's my friend, right? And so the barrier tends to be at the hiring stage. That recruitment is where a huge amount of the barrier is. So that is a real pinch point where if we can improve our HR people, our recruitment people, we will get some real benefits. And I think that's something we can do very quickly and very deliberately if we wish to do that. The third thing is around once people are inside of organizations, we kind of go, well, you're an engineer or you're whatever. You'll be happy just doing that job, right? Because you're a smart person, you don't need to become a manager or a leader. Why not? Why is it that we see our ethnic communities, despite having the skill and the experience, not having the same career progression as others? Discrimination. And I think that's partly our HR processes and other things, and just being really deliberate inside our organizations that this happens. And the final thing is around entrepreneurship. Clearly, we use immigration policy for workers, not for entrepreneurship, and we do nothing to encourage those people who have entrepreneur zeal. So we need to think about if we want to do that differently, and if we do, what can we do about creating connections, networks, mentoring? Quite often it doesn't take that much. It's actually possible to do it with the networks that we have. So it takes us back to where I started, that frame of acculturation. And the frame of acculturation, I think for me, is asking that broad question of what is it that we want our immigrants, our new citizens to do? And what is it that we want the host citizens to do? And these are really big asks, right? Both in terms of what do we want to preserve of our culture and heritage, and what do we want to do with our interactions with the wider diverse community. And for us to get those things that we say that we want, which is around integration and multiculturalism, if we really believe it, it means that we want the immigrants to change and we want ourselves to change. That second part is quite often quiet, unsaid, and assumed not to apply. It cannot be. You cannot have integration without the host society change it. You cannot have multiculturalism without the host society changing. And the promise of Te Tiriti, the promise of the Bicultural Foundation of New Zealand is equal opportunities for everybody regardless of their ethnicity, race, whatever. That is actually the promise of Te Tiriti. And to me, this is that two-way street. That's the difficult conversation that New Zealand has to embark on, is how do we do it? And it's not clear to me that I know the answer to that yet. Next slide. But I think it starts with telling ourselves that there are no unicorns that we can use. So this is something that I use quite often because quite often I see our politicians telling us, look, trust me, elect me, and I'll take care of everything and nothing has to change for you, but everything will still get better. Right? Really? And they're telling us that they're going to be good, fast, and cheap all at the same time. But in reality, those things are very rare. We are choosing between choices that are expensive, choices that are slow, or choices that are terrible. What can you sell as a politician? The terrible solution, the slow solution, or the expensive solution? In a 3-year term, you can't sell any of them, so you're forced into selling the unicorn. They sell us the unicorn, we don't like the fact that we didn't get the unicorn, and we get rid of them. But the next lot also offer us the unicorn, can't deliver it, and we get rid of them. I fear that right now we are stuck in a trap of promising each other unicorns, knowing very well it's a mirage. Next slide. But I think if we want to move to something that actually works, it's, I think, a conversation that's a little bit different. And that conversation is about having a strategy that's about long-term goals. I don't think we can change things for the better immediately. There is no such thing. There are no short-term gratifications for this. I think we have to think long-term about what would I like to see for my kids and grandkids? And then think very specifically about what are the kinds of tools we might use, whether it's in recruitment or whether it's in social interaction, whether it's in third spaces to allow people to interact with each other. But the final one is probably the most important. When we make civic decisions, political decisions, we do it in a centralized way, right? We go, we've made this decision, what do you think about that, Phil? Make a submission, right? But what we don't do is a truly deliberative approach of actually asking people, actually engaging with people to take people through the process. I did a piece of work after the Canterbury earthquakes to understand why was it that Canterbury was able to build relatively quickly. Because the scale of the damage was so big, it was a surprise to me that it did it quite so fast. And the history behind that was, for about 10, 15 years, the Greater Christchurch Partnership had been working with some difficulty to figure out where the future growth of Canterbury region would go, in terms of where the houses would go, where the infrastructure would go, and who would pay for it. And they had been fighting about it for a long time. So people had a lot of input. So people had been heard, and the plan had been morphing, and it kind of was good enough. You know, about 90% of the population were pretty okay with it. So when the earthquake happened, Jerry pretty much went and said, that's good enough, we will implement this plan. That was the reason why Canterbury was able to build quickly after the earthquake, because there was a plan that was ready to go that had already been contested, and people were broadly happy with it. It was the process of the interaction, that long period of 10 to 15 years when people were engaging with this issue. They learned, they had their views heard, they had the policy changed, and it was good enough in the end for that to work. A contrast to that was the very successful house building program in Rotorua to house homeless people. It was working really well from a technical perspective. All the important people were in the room. They got together in a little room, closed all the doors and windows, and made the decisions and built those houses. And they were doing a fabulous job of building those houses. But the community was left out. And the community said no. And they made it stop. And they were successful. The consequence now is they're complaining about the homeless people on the streets. So there is a little irony there, but I guess the reality is that if you don't take people with you, the process of making the decision is as important as the decision itself. And for local government in particular, it's particularly important because our ways of doing that deliberation, that seeking of community input, where I have to go in and make a submission. I do because I'm a nerd, I love this stuff. I write 50 pages of documents to submit to these things. The lawyer in Herne Bay does the same. But the person who's unemployed or has 5 jobs in South Auckland doesn't. And therein lies some of the challenge of how do we get true representation in a community. But it's not just representation, it's the process of interacting in civics. It's the process that's important. It's not just the decision you make, it's how you make the decisions. And I know I'm lecturing you guys here, but this last bit is the bit that I think we could do better immediately if we wanted to. It doesn't require policy changes, it doesn't require anything, it just requires us to behave differently. It requires us to engage differently. And the thing that we want as a result of this is when we make decisions, they're consistent, they're coherent, and they're credible. Because how often do we find policies that try to do a good thing here, but does a bad thing over there? All the time. That lack of consistency is the problem, and I think when it comes to, when I'm thinking about the issues of diversity and changing New Zealand, I feel like, one, we have no strategy. We haven't thought about the instruments that we want to use to deal with this issue. And certainly, we're not creating those processes where we can interact with each other to be able to learn from each other more, to be able to do this better. Next slide, please. So I was doing a piece of work for MB some years ago with Tuhoi. So MB and Tuhoi were at loggerheads like this because of many reasons. But one of the reasons was when it came to economic development, how they were describing economic success was very different. And so they were finding it really hard to reach any consensus. They were finding it very difficult to make progress. So they hired me because, I'm the wrong kind of brown, so I could go and say anything to both groups. And I was very overconfident, as economists are. You might have noticed that I have a lot of confidence. So I went and told Tamati, look, Tamati, I know how economic development works. It's easy. Gates and ladders. Stop doing the stuff that holds your economy back and build some ladders for the things that work for your economy. It's not that hard. Tamati looked at me for a while. He takes his time. And he said, Shamabila, I think you missed the most important part. You can identify all the technical solutions of the gates and ladders you want, but if you don't take your people with you, those solutions will not be implemented consistently over time. That endurance and consistency will not happen. The coordination and cohesion that you need, the unity that you need, can only happen through the process of dialogue and interaction. And I thought that was a very powerful rebuttal to my theory of how the economy and society works. Right? I was thinking about it in a very technical term of those technical policies, those technical ways that we could do things. Of course, those things are important, but they're not enough on their own. How we do things matters just as much. In fact, they probably matter more than we have thought about before, because our society is becoming fragmented, it's looking more different. I don't think we're that different if we look to each other and actually talk to each other, but we think we're different. And that's how we get positive change. So this theory was, I think, to me, very powerful as a kind of personal growth moment. It was pretty big because it was one of those light bulb moments, right? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's really powerful. Next slide, please. So here are some ideas. And some of the ways that I think about doing this is, I think there is a temptation for us to try and do these things in a centralized way. So there is this issue of diversity. I'm now going to set up a standing committee and I'm going to solve this. Well, I don't know. Do you really have all the answers? Probably not. Part of the issue is when you have a centralized decision-making system, it becomes a very extractive process. You do it for yourself. You see it, you see yourself above the thing. It's me doing something to society rather than me within society that's trying to shape it. So the reality is that rather than trying to hoard the decision-making, I think we need to move towards a far more participatory process. Because if we don't, what we're going to find is our diverse communities don't get represented. Their views are not heard, but their views are not being adapted and they're not learning. That learning exercise that we all do is not happening. The second part is thinking about our normative order, and what I really mind, what I'm talking about there is our conception of our values, our expression of our values. And culture is one of those words that does so much heavy lifting, right? But fundamentally, that's the reason why we don't need rules for everything, because it's unsaid. It's agreed between us that there's a particular standard of behavior or way of doing things. And rules only work when you have communities that have cohesive values. When you have incohesive values, inconsistent values, rules don't work. Rules are not above it. They're not a substitute. Rules are built on top of the shared values of a place. Community is meant to be messy. When I was down in Balclutha, I was interviewing these people about this housing program they've done in Kaitangata. And it was a fabulous story. These kind of unlikely heroes that came together. They don't really like each other very much. And they said, but we don't have meetings. We just get together. We're aligned on a common purpose. We come together and we just get it done because we are driven to make this thing happen. But what we found once we worked together was when we thought we didn't like each other, we were wrong. We had a lot more in common once we spent time with each other and we worked together to a common purpose. So it revealed a lot of that common bonds when people spend time together. But community has a lot of strength, a lot of knowledge, a lot of know-how that's at the grassroots that we're not utilizing. And with the loss of many of our civic society organizations, I don't know if you guys noticed, like our incorporated societies, we're probably going to lose thousands of them come a month's time, right? Because lots of them haven't refiled their new things. So, we've got a 100-year rugby club that might disappear in a month's time. For real? These are important places where you go not just to play rugby, but because you hang out and see people who are different to yourself. It's a cross-section of society that comes together. When I was having a beer at the Tokoroa Club, I'm a card-carrying member of the Tokoroa Club, the fee was quite exorbitant, $20 for a year. I loved it because what was really beautiful was, you know, the guy who was chopping down trees that morning, the guy who sold me a t-shirt at the clothing shop, the lady who made me a coffee, they were all at the table having a beer with me at the end of the day. And that leveler, that ability for us to kind of do that kind of connection in community is really important. And the final thing is, I think that there will always be winners and losers. I think there's a real temptation for us to think that we can all be winners. You're great, you participated, isn't it wonderful? Well, no, it's not. It's just not real. Life has winners and losers, and I think we just have to be grown up and grow some balls and call it out. That this is the reality of life, that there will be some costs, and there will be some benefits, and those benefits might not be to me. Are we willing to do that? And that's a really big question. I won't always say yes to that question myself, because quite often your selfish streak strikes, because you kind of go, well, do I really want to pay that extra tax? I mean, even though I call taxes love, and the New Zealand Initiative was very upset by that. But the reality is that we will always have that moment of thinking that we can do all of it, but we can't. Next. So this is my very last slide. But this was the final picture of that work with Tūhoi. And there was a great illustrator in the room, and she drew this picture up. And I wrote like a really big, long report. Nobody read it, but this picture kind of looks really good. On the left-hand side is the picture of success for the bureaucrats in Wellington. On the right-hand side is the picture of success for the people of Taniatua. Both of those pictures are beautiful. They're both beautiful mountains, but they're islands, right? When you have these pictures of success, there's stories about yourselves, your culture, your whatever. When you do it in isolation, you have two islands that look beautiful, but they're different. They're not the same. Those mountains don't overlap, and unless they overlap, we will not be able to have shared purpose and shared direction. When I look at the work that I'm doing in social cohesion, what I find is even when you account for ethnicity, we have a lot more in common than we have in difference. That is the starting point. But at the moment, we identify them as islands. We treat each other as islands. And if we want to make progress, if we want to realize the opportunity of Auckland, which is changing very fast and will continue to change, I think the big task in front of us is how do we change ourselves and our community processes so that those two mountains come closer together. Thank you.
Shamabeel, thanks very much. We've got question time. When the aim with the question time is for you to put up your hand, and Catherine will get you on screen, and we'll broadcast you to the world. Well, I do have a question because I've got the microphone. In 2023, we managed to get Andrew Little over the line with Labor committing to a population plan with a subset of an immigration plan, which you would think a normal society would develop. And it was I was pretty disappointed when they were beaten, because that was a chance to really do a lot of this stuff. But then I noticed on Sunday that Shane Jones is now championing a population plan. Comment.
No, look, I think absolutely. I've written about this many times in the past. We do want to be deliberate. And I think both for New Zealand and for the immigrants, we want to have a consistency and certainty of who we want to be here and why, and what rights and pathways will we give them. And a population strategy would absolutely do that. I think it's a no-brainer. I think it should be a completely apolitical thing, because it would be good for everybody. Very easy to say, hard to do.
Wait for the camera.
Oh.
Yeah, go.
Kia ora, thank you so much for that presentation. A few years ago, Damon Salesa did a presentation, a piece of research about the segregation that's happening in Auckland with communities that aren't mixing at all, and particularly around our schools. And it's, must be getting worse and worse. And I just wondered if that research is something that you have drawn on, and if it's complementary to what you've presented today, if you have any thoughts about how we can tap into our strength, which is our diversity, but how we can confront the fact that we're actually not, it's not an Auckland that everyone is sharing in and participating in. We're actually getting more segregated.
Yeah, no, really good point. And I've spoken to Damon at length about this, mainly when he's sitting next to me on a plane and he can't escape. But the conversation's always been, there was the reality of what we saw in certain parts of Auckland, but I think that is changing because even in previous strongholds of Pacifica communities or Maori communities, now we've got new immigrants coming and those communities are changing really fast. But you're absolutely right. I think there's a real risk that we see this segregation that's taking place. And that's the concern that I have, is we are very rapidly now getting into the risk of having communities that are isolated and separated from each other, that social interaction that I talked about is not taking place across all parts of society. It's kind of like the Remuera mum saying, you know, I don't go to South Auckland except to the airport, right? And there is an element of that that's quite problematic, but I don't know how to fix it, because a certain amount of the segregation will happen in terms of where you live, but we need to have third spaces and events and other things where we still get the opportunity to mix. You can't force people. I mean, there's a class system in every community, and so we can't hide from that. But I think creating those opportunities that are in spite of that is useful. I think one of the things that I would really love to see in places like Auckland, particularly in the city centre, is far more activation of our public spaces. Our public spaces are very good in terms of having hard surfaces that are ready to go, but they're not activated. As a result, we don't have as much of that intermingling as we could. I think that's where it starts. We have to make small beginnings. I don't think there is an end to this, any quick fix to the concentration or isolation we're seeing within certain communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Shamaville. That was very good. And I also want to talk about isolation, but language policy. And I wondered if in your research you looked at language communities, not just people migrating here, keeping their own language, but also policy about whether language teaching in schools, universities, polytechs and so on is being as valued as well as it should, because as you said before, we all need to change. Yeah. New migrants do need to learn some English if they're able to, or sign language or Māori, and we all need to learn at least one other language that's spoken in the community.
What a great question, and one that I didn't look at specifically for this presentation, but I did a piece of work for one of the Chinese groups, I can't remember who, but essentially what we found was, for a while we had this great obsession with teaching Japanese in schools, and then it fell away, and then it wasn't really replaced with anything. And so when it comes to language teaching in New Zealand, if you're in privileged schools, usually it's still available. If you're not in a privileged school, it's kind of fallen away. I think it's a real loss for New Zealand, because a lot of that benefit of the diversity we have in New Zealand and a lot of that ability to kind of connect across cultures is through language. And language teaching has been pushed further and further down. I think over the course of the last 20 years, what I've noticed, and this is a fairly uneducated outside view in, is our education system has tried to become much more focused on things like science and the technical and hard stuff, which in my view is completely and utterly moronic, because with technology, that's the first thing that's going to get automated. What won't get automated is the arts and the humanities and those kinds of things. So the ability to kind of access a wide variety of culture and history is going to be through language, and unfortunately I think that's been massively downgraded. In communities, what we're finding is almost a bifurcation with kids. Spoken languages are either they maintain their culture or they don't have it at all. So it's becoming very much a case that, you know, if you've got a household where they're maintaining a language, that will survive, but there are some households that are actively choosing not to, because they might have a household with 2 different languages. Which one do you choose? So there's a whole bunch of complications that are coming up. It's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that other than to say, I think it's really valuable. I wish more of our teaching resource was available for that. But if you think about the funding for our schools and the funding for things like community education, so squeezed. I just don't think the resourcing is available for us to kind of really tap into that. Sir. Oh, hello.
Kia ora, Cheryl. Well, thanks very much. Excellent nerdy talk. Well communicated. Thanks for that. I appreciated this idea of things are changing so fast that we actually need to be quite deliberative about how we get to that integration, multicultural space. And you put up some technical-ish questions, solutions,
Yes.
and now you've just been talking about much more cultural
Yes.
or school or education-based approaches, which I think are the really positive sides of different cultures that can be celebrated and brought together. And I do see schools doing this much better now and are much more kind of attuned to it. And when you look at positive things like kapahaka, there's just so blossomed.
Like my experience in Balclutha.
Yeah,
Either was just
half of them are
beautiful.
Pākehā kids or something like, So I do think the deliberative cultural uplifting and through the school system, not just education, but what they actually do in their practices, I think is a really powerful ways to lift up this multiculturalism.
Absolutely. So again, very much work in development, but in our social cohesion work, that's really what we are researching at the moment in terms of what could we do differently. And one of the big parts is how and what we teach. So education is a critical part of how we create social cohesion. And it's really around, it's not about saying that you need to be respectful. It's about actually giving the kids the tools to be able to engage with each other and all those other bits and pieces. So, but we don't teach leadership very well. We don't teach conflict management very well. We don't teach a lot of these other things. It's not just the skills like languages. It's also just the tools to be able to deal with people who are different. And, I think we could all do with a bit of that. There's just so much anger in so many of the public spaces, that being able to navigate that is actually really powerful for all of us.
Last one. Just the last question. It's on.
Thanks. When it comes to recognising qualifications for overseas, to what extent is our current system, which can include the IELTS test, for example, fit for purpose? My understanding is it's a private organisation, so there's an incentive to fail people, and it's very costly.
Yeah, that's a can of worms, isn't it? Look, essentially what we found was it's not working. There are people with credentials, and those credentials are not being utilised. They're not actually creating the pathways that we want. So whatever we have as a system at the moment is not working in actually creating the outcome that we want, right? The whole point of education is for people to both learn and to be able to maximize their potential. And if you're not, something's wrong. And it's not just about qualifications, recognition. Sometimes, there are genuine differences in qualifications, and that's fine. But then it means we have to provide that support for people to upskill to be able to fill that gap. And that's not really there. So in terms of the private education sector, I have a fairly jaundiced view with a lot of the things that go on there. So, let's not open the can of worms tonight. But it's probably a conversation you should have at some point, because there is a real industry that's of a fast food nature that's doing a great disservice to its people and to New Zealand. What a negative note to end on.
Hey, I think we can give Shamabeel a round of applause. That's been a spectacular. That's been a spectacular address, and I'm reminded of the joke that Mr. Bean told, I think, where he said, "I intend to speak as the vicar sung in the church without notes." And Shamabeel gave us a wonderful address that was sort of freestanding, fluid, comprehensive, thoroughly entertaining, but more importantly, challenging. And it's the challenge that I'm so proud of, that we get from the Fabians, and we get from the speakers that Fabians manages to arrive at. I'm reminded, Shamabeel mentioned Adam Smith, I'm reminded that in our history we had a pretty amazing scholar, Bill MacArthur, give a speech to us about his work on Adam Smith some time ago, who reminded us that it was not all about the wealth of nations, it's actually about the strength of community, and how the theories and the ideas can get lost in the way in which we passage them through time and bring them into our current debate. I'm very proud of the fact that when I look around this audience, I see a lot of people who I know belong to networks that can spread the word, because the Fabians' basic credo is incite debate, and I really appreciate that you will go out there and incite debate and do stuff which means that we connect the dots to get the type of social cohesion that will stand us in good stead and not continue to drive us apart. So thank you so much, Somerville. It was a really good address. And finally, can I say in front of such a bright audience that the best way you can help the Fabians is by going onto the website. As I keep saying, click on the button that says donate, think of a number and double it and donate it. And we would love to have your support. It's that support which brings us together. It gives us this equipment, and it gives us the ability to have this up on YouTube tonight. So thank you all for coming and have a safe journey home.
That would be a good speech, mate.